The sound of distant cannon fire rolling across Europe did not cross the Atlantic as noise, but as an idea that pressed slowly and relentlessly against the conscience of a rising nation, forcing America to ask whether distance alone could protect it from the storms of history. In the early 20th century, the United States stood at a turning point, wealthy in resources, confident in progress, and deeply divided over its role in the world, while faraway empires armed themselves and alliances hardened into lines that would soon shatter peace itself. When war erupted in Europe during the summer of 1914, it appeared at first as a foreign tragedy, rooted in old rivalries and crowned heads. Yet beneath the surface it threatened global trade, human lives, and the very meaning of modern civilization. At the center of the American response stood Woodrow Wilson, a former scholar turned president, whose calm voice and moral certainty concealed a profound inner struggle over power, responsibility, and destiny. Wilson believed deeply that history moved according to principles, not chance, and that nations, like individuals, were accountable to higher standards than mere survival or ambition. As bullets and shells carved new borders through fields and cities overseas, the United States attempted to remain neutral in action and spirit, hoping that restraint might preserve peace at home and provide an example to the world. Wilson spoke of impartiality not only in policy, but in thought, urging Americans to rise above the passions of war even as newspapers filled with reports of atrocities, heroism, and suffering on an unprecedented scale. Europe, once viewed as a distant stage for ancient conflicts, now appeared connected to American prosperity through trade routes, immigration, and shared ideals, creating a tension between moral sympathy and political caution that grew sharper with every passing month. The Great War, as it quickly became known, pitted the Allied powers of Britain, France, and Russia against the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, drawing millions of soldiers into trenches that stretched for miles and turning industrial technology into instruments of mass death. While monarchs and generals promised swift victory, the reality hardened into stalemate, grinding down armies and civilians alike, and revealing that this conflict was unlike any before it in scale or consequence. In the United States, public opinion fractured along ethnic, cultural, and economic lines, as German Americans feared persecution, Irish Americans resisted sympathy for Britain, and business leaders watched nervously as European markets collapsed or shifted under the pressure of war. Wilson understood that neutrality was not a simple absence of action, but an active and often lonely stance that required constant defense against those who demanded intervention or total isolation. He faced a nation that had emerged victorious and confident from the Spanish-American War, but remained haunted by the warnings of its founders against entangling alliances and foreign wars. The president viewed his role as that of a guardian, protecting American lives and principles while seeking a path that might one day allow the United States to shape peace rather than merely witness destruction. Yet neutrality grew more difficult as British naval power restricted American trade with Germany, while German submarines prowled the Atlantic, challenging traditional rules of warfare and placing civilian ships at risk. Each diplomatic note, sent across the ocean, carried not only words, but the weight of millions of lives and the future of American influence beyond its shores. Wilson, trained in history and political theory, believed that leadership required patience, reason, and moral clarity, yet the modern world rewarded speed, force, and decisive action, creating a collision between idealism and reality that defined his presidency. As reports of sinking ships and drowned civilians reached American newspapers, the distance between the trenches of Europe and the streets of American cities seemed to shrink, pulling citizens into emotional arguments about honor, safety, and obligation. Still, Wilson held firm to the belief that America must serve as an independent voice, capable of mediating peace when exhaustion finally overcame the combatants, and he warned that entering the war too early would sacrifice lives without achieving lasting resolution. His speeches framed the conflict as a test not only of armies, but of civilization itself, asking whether progress had truly made humanity wiser or merely more efficient at killing. Beneath his calm public demeanor lay a man deeply aware of the historical moment, conscious that future generations would judge whether he had acted too slowly or too hastily in the face of global catastrophe. By the middle years of the war, as casualty numbers climbed into the millions and entire regions were reduced to ruin, the illusion that the conflict could be contained within Europe began to fade, and America's economic and moral connections to the warring nations grew impossible to ignore. Wilson now stood on the edge of a narrowing path, attempting to guide a powerful but hesitant nation through a world that demanded choices rather than neutrality, aware that the decision to step onto the world stage would forever change the meaning of American power and responsibility. As the war dragged on into its second and third years, the promise of a short and decisive conflict dissolved completely, replaced by a brutal routine of trench warfare that transformed landscapes into scars and soldiers into statistics. Reports reaching the United States spoke of mud-filled trenches, poison gas drifting silently at dawn, and artillery barrages that lasted for days, shaking the earth itself. And these images slowly reshaped American understanding of what modern war truly meant. Wilson followed these developments closely, reading diplomatic cables and intelligence summaries with the eye of a historian who understood that such events would redefine international relations long after the fighting stopped. Despite his determination to remain neutral, the economic reality of the war pulled the United States closer to the Allied powers, as American factories produced food, weapons, and supplies that flowed across the Atlantic to Britain and France in ever-increasing quantities. German leaders viewed this trade as a direct threat, even though it followed international law, and they searched for ways to weaken Allied strength without provoking direct American involvement. The submarine became Germany's chosen answer, a new and terrifying weapon that ignored traditional naval rules and struck without warning beneath the waves. In early encounters, Wilson protested strongly when American ships were threatened, insisting that neutral nations had rights that must be respected, and he warned Germany that unrestricted submarine attacks would carry serious consequences. These warnings were soon tested when passenger vessels crossing the Atlantic became targets, collapsing the boundary between civilian life and military strategy. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 marked a psychological turning point for the American public, as headlines described the deaths of innocent men, women, and children, including American citizens, lost to the cold sea in minutes. Wilson responded with controlled outrage, refusing to rush the nation into war, yet making it clear through firm diplomatic messages that such actions violated human decency as well as international norms. His restraint angered interventionists who believed honor demanded an immediate declaration of war, while pacifists feared that even harsh words edged the nation closer to bloodshed. Germany, sensing American anger, temporarily moderated its submarine campaign, offering assurances that passenger ships would be spared, and this uneasy pause allowed Wilson to continue his balancing act between peace and preparedness. At home, he faced re-election in 1916, campaigning under the message that he had kept the nation out of war, a claim that resonated with voters weary of foreign conflict and fearful of its costs. His narrow victory reflected a country still divided, yet it also placed upon him a renewed responsibility to decide how long neutrality could realistically be maintained. Behind the scenes, Wilson authorized measures to strengthen the military, expanding the Army and Navy in case diplomacy failed, recognizing that credibility abroad required strength as well as principle. He also began to articulate a broader vision for the post-war world, one that would move beyond shifting alliances and secret treaties toward a system based on collective security and open agreements. This vision rested on the belief that peace must be constructed deliberately, guided by shared values rather than imposed through conquest or fear. As 1917 approached, the pressures intensified, driven not only by events at sea but by political changes within the warring nations themselves. In Germany, military leaders argued that unrestricted submarine warfare offered the best hope for victory before American industrial power could fully tilt the balance toward the Allies. They calculated that Britain could be starved into surrender within months, and that the United States, even if angered, would be too slow to mobilize effectively. When Germany announced the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare in early 1917, Wilson recognized that the path he had tried so carefully to hold was collapsing beneath his feet. Almost simultaneously, the revelation of the Zimmermann telegram shocked the American public, as it revealed Germany's proposal of a military alliance with Mexico against the United States, promising territory in return. The message struck at the heart of national security, transforming abstract debates about rights and neutrality into concrete fears of invasion and betrayal. Wilson now faced a reality he had long sought to avoid, yet had never stopped preparing for, as diplomatic avenues narrowed and the safety of American lives and sovereignty came into direct question. His response was deliberate, not impulsive, reflecting his belief that a nation must understand why it fights before it sends its sons to die. In speeches and discussions with advisors, Wilson framed the crisis as more than a series of attacks or insults, describing it instead as a fundamental challenge to the principles of free navigation, self-determination, and lawful international conduct. The decision before him was no longer whether America might influence the world, but whether it could afford not to, as silence and restraint now seemed to invite greater dangers rather than prevent them. Each sinking ship, each intercepted message, and each diplomatic failure added weight to the conclusion forming in his mind that the United States could not remain merely an observer without surrendering its moral voice and strategic security. As the nation stood on the edge of war, Wilson prepared to ask Congress and the people to accept a role that would redefine American identity, transforming a republic long cautious of foreign entanglements into a decisive actor on the global stage, driven not by conquest, but by the hope of shaping a more stable and just international order. When Woodrow Wilson stood before Congress in April of 1917, the chamber was silent not with uncertainty, but with the heavy awareness that history had narrowed into a single moment of choice. His words did not thunder with calls for revenge or glory, but moved steadily through reason and resolve, presenting war as a solemn duty forced upon the nation rather than a desire it had sought. He spoke of armed neutrality having failed, of American ships sunk and lives lost, and of a world order threatened by actions that recognized no law except force. Most powerfully, he framed the coming conflict as a moral struggle, declaring that the world must be made safe for democracy, a phrase that elevated the decision beyond national interest and into the realm of universal principle. Congress responded with a declaration of war against Germany, and with that vote the United States stepped fully onto the world stage, carrying with it immense industrial power, fresh armies, and an untested sense of global responsibility. Mobilization transformed American society at a speed never seen before, as factories retooled for war production, railroads coordinated national logistics, and millions of young men answered the call to service. Training camps rose across the country, turning civilians into soldiers, while women stepped into new roles in industry and public life, reshaping social norms even as the nation focused on victory. When American troops arrived in Europe, their presence injected energy and confidence into Allied lines exhausted by years of stalemate, signaling that the balance of the war had finally begun to shift. Wilson remained in Washington, guiding diplomacy and war aims, insisting that military success must serve a larger purpose than revenge or territorial gain. In January of 1918, he outlined his vision in the 14 points, a detailed plan for peace that called for open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, reduced armaments, national self-determination, and the creation of a League of Nations to prevent future wars. These ideas reflected his lifelong belief that lasting peace required structure, cooperation, and moral commitment rather than temporary settlements enforced by fear. As American soldiers fought in brutal battles at places like Cantigny, Saint-Mihiel, and the Meuse-Argonne, the war ground toward its end, with Germany facing collapse from within as well as defeat on the battlefield. When the armistice was signed in November of 1918, the guns finally fell silent, ending a conflict that had claimed millions of lives and reshaped continents. Wilson traveled to Europe afterward, the first sitting American president to do so, receiving cheering crowds who saw in him the promise of a new kind of international leadership. At the Paris Peace Conference, however, idealism collided once again with political reality, as Allied leaders, driven by loss and anger, demanded harsh penalties against Germany. Wilson fought to preserve his vision, sacrificing some points to secure the creation of the League of Nations, believing it to be the cornerstone of future peace. Yet even as he achieved victory abroad, opposition grew at home, where critics feared that international commitments would erode American sovereignty. The United States Senate ultimately rejected membership in the League, a decision that deeply wounded Wilson and limited the reach of his post-war vision. Though physically exhausted and politically weakened, he never abandoned the belief that principles mattered more than popularity, and that leadership required moral courage even in defeat. History would judge his achievements as incomplete, yet profoundly influential, setting the stage for future global engagement and shaping debates that continue into the modern era. America emerged from the war no longer a distant power protected by oceans, but a central force whose actions could alter the fate of nations. The journey from neutrality to intervention revealed that isolation offered only the illusion of safety in an interconnected world, and that values unprotected by action could not endure. The moral lesson carried forward from Wilson's leadership is that power guided by conscience can aspire to build peace, but responsibility cannot be avoided without consequence, and the choices of a single moment may define the character of a nation for generations to come.